Our next speaker will be Sam Patten, who is Senior Program Manager for Eurasia at a major human rights watchdog, Freedom House, with headquarters in Washington and New York. Sam, please.
Thank you, Peter. On behalf of Freedom House, I'm very pleased to be here and speak with you today. It's fitting and appropriate that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly should address the issue of corruption in this meeting. It is an important time to address an important issue. Corruption is not relative, it is not victimless, and it's not without a cure. Corruption, it can be said, is relative in that some countries are more corrupt than others, that those countries east of Vienna can be held to a different standard than those countries in Europe, North America, or elsewhere within the OSCE mandate. That can be a dangerous assumption. Corruption is the same. It is defined as a violation of the public trust, the violation of public trust for private gain. It happens throughout the Eurasian space, and that's why it's important that the OSCE begin to take strong action to counter it. Corruption is not victimless. It's not victimless because the victims of corruption are the citizens of those countries who lose out on the benefits of the economic system and the sense of public trust that their governments ought to guarantee. And corruption is not without a cure. Too often people can throw up their hands and say that corruption is an endemic problem with deep cultural roots. There is a cure to corruption. There are specific steps that states can take. And this meeting of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is a good opportunity to explore some concrete actions for addressing corruption. Freedom House is probably best known for its publications. Every year we issue a series of publications, Freedom in the World being the longest standing of these. But the Nations in Transit survey, which we also produce every year, is especially relevant to the OSCE space. Each year we look at 29 former communist countries in the Eastern Bloc as well as the former Soviet Union, and grade those countries on a series of criteria, of which corruption is one. This year, in fact 2 weeks ago, we released our most recent, our 2010 report, which charts 2009 activity, and the findings were pretty grim. Of the 29 countries, we saw regression in 14 of them, nearly half. 6 of those countries were in the former Soviet Union. 6 of them were new entries into the European Union. It shows how widespread and endemic corruption is. Just a few examples, and 2 of the countries were in the Balkans. Looking at some of, Kyrgyzstan is an issue that we can talk about because it's in the news. We're engaged there. All of our organizations are engaged there. And corruption is very central to the changes that we've seen in Kyrgyzstan. What makes Kyrgyzstan different than many of the other countries, certainly in Central Asia, but also in the former Soviet space, is that it always enjoyed a status of being slightly more free than other countries in Central Asia. It was perhaps that very sense of civic entitlement, of civic activity, that led people in Alatu Square to demand change in their government in April and to overthrow what is clearly a corrupt Bakiyev regime. The Bakiyev regime was perhaps no more corrupt than any other regime in Central Asia or in any other part of Eurasia for that matter. But the Kyrgyz had expected a higher degree of accountability, which is what empowered and encouraged ordinary Kyrgyz citizens to go out to the street and demand change. The scale of corruption in a country the size of Kyrgyzstan and with an economy as small as Kyrgyzstan, with a gross national product boiling down to something like $2,100 per citizen, is hard to ignore. And because it was so hard to ignore, it sparked outrage among the public in Kyrgyzstan, and hopefully that very sense of outrage will spread to other countries where people may also demand accountability and change in their government. There are larger and far more corrupt countries in the Eurasian land space. Russia is an easy country to look at. In the last year, we've seen the tragic death of a 37-year-old lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Mr. Magnitsky was different than many of the other people who die as a result of human rights abuses in Russia because he wasn't a human rights defender. Oftentimes people, particularly in Russia, will say human rights defenders are asking for it. They're walking around Chechnya, Ingushetia, places looking for trouble, and they deserve what they get. Magnitsky was different because he was an ordinary lawyer simply doing his job. He died in police custody because he uncovered corruption on a scale that shocked the conscience of the Russian people. The president of the Russian Federation has been forced to demand change, but as we've seen too often with President Dmitry Medvedev, there's a big gap between what he says and what the Russian government actually delivers. There's a less well-known, and I think in some ways equally poignant case in Russia. The editor of Korruptsiya i Presnosnosti, excuse my poor Russian, Corruption and Crime in Rostov-na-Donu was murdered in April of this year, one of many journalists to die in a country that is seen as one of the most dangerous and violent countries for journalists in the world. And why is this? Why is it so difficult for press freedoms to thrive in Russia or elsewhere in the Eurasian space? Is it because totalitarian, authoritarian regimes resent the freedom of press in particular? I don't think it's so much that as that there is an interrelated, there's interrelation between the freedom of the press, corruption, judicial independence, local self-government, and all the other aspects on which Freedom House grades countries on fundamental freedoms every year. There is, corruption creates a motive for governments to, if they are not free, if there are not institutions in place to counter corruption, to silence those who uncover corruption. And too often representatives of the media are the victims of a pushback against transparency and accountability, where the media has to be the court of first and last resort when the judicial system doesn't work at all. Across other countries, one country which was neither downgraded nor upgraded this year was Ukraine. Ukraine, interestingly, of all the former Soviet countries, is the only country we haven't seen significant degradation in the last 2 decades. However, there are worrying signs now with a new government in Ukraine that has already allowed moves against the freedom of the press. We have seen press outlets in Ukraine come under the consolidated control, including that of the director of the State Security Organization. It is a cause of concern and one that we will be looking at with continued scrutiny as the year unfolds. There are bright spots as well. Another country that did not get downgraded nor upgraded this year was the Republic of Georgia. Since the Rose Revolution in 2004, one of the more positive developments in Georgia has been a systematic crackdown on corruption. Georgia is one of the only countries in the former Soviet space now where motorists are not randomly pulled over by road police and bribes demanded, where the police have adopted new standards of accountability, and accountability at a scale that it creates concern and fear in those countries which have not adopted similar standards of accountability. That may account for some of the animosity that countries, particularly one northern neighbor of Georgia, has expressed in recent years. In closing, I'd just like to say it's very important when looking at corruption to look at how it operates in a way like cancer. It corrodes the very system of government. It corrodes the relationships between the governed and the governed, as Peter said, between the haves and the have-nots. And only by addressing corruption at its core, only by increasing disclosure of public officials' assets and business relationships, in protecting the whistleblowers or those people who have the courage to step forward, and passing other types of accountable reform, can governments move forward and cleanse the scourge of corruption, which is bringing democratic governance down across the Eurasian landmass. And with that, my colleague from Global Witness, I'm sure will have some more specific recommendations about how to fight corruption.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Sam.